The audience may have loved it. Unfortunately, not everybody felt the same way.
There is a tradition for Cameron after an opening night that the following day we have always a lunch.
We had bottles of champagne with Les Miserables labels on, but nobody wanted to drink it because we had the reviews in front of us. People were just shell-shocked.
For the tabloid, it was not a musical because we had 30 dead bodies on stage at the end, no tap dance, nothing.
Some of the critics so hated the idea that the RSC should do a musical that they were almost vindictive. They wanted to hurt us, I think.
No one was saying it, but it looked like the answer was going to be, it's the end of the road.
I thought I'll get rid of all the bad news at once and find out what's happening at the box office. And I eventually got through, and they said, how did you get through? We've already sold 5,000 tickets, and it's the biggest day we've ever had. I still, to this day, don't know why it happened so quickly.
And tapped his glass and said, I've got something to tell you all. The audience is going wild. I'm going to transfer it.
The theatre is littered with stories like that. The most revolutionary shows simply isn't in the mindset of the movers and shakers, and it's sometimes the audience is ahead of the, well, quite often the audience is ahead of the critics.
Do you hear the people sing, lost in the valley of the night?
On its move to the Palace Theatre, tickets to Les Miserables became the most sought after in London, providing another hit for Mackintosh and much-needed income for a cash-strapped RSC. It has gone on to play in 37 countries around the world, been translated into 21 languages, and has celebrated 25 years on the West End stage.
I don't think anybody ever expected Les Mis to be the massive global success it became.
Why did it work? Because it is musically absolutely thrilling. It's absolutely believably something that's in the 19th century, and yet it hits you right in the chest. It hits you emotionally as something completely contemporary.
One of the reasons the show still remains one of the most current contemporary pieces is because the story and the characters are recognisable in society today just as they were 150 years ago. They never date and they never will date because human nature doesn't learn from itself.
And it's to do with the last number of the show, directly sung to the audience. Will you join in our crusade?
Do you want a better tomorrow? Tomorrow comes. People just used to stand up like, yes, yes, I do believe in that. I don't know how it's to be accomplished, but yes.
The success of the West End musical was generating huge amounts of money. By the end of the decade, Broadway's biggest export would have earned just £5 million at the box office. Cats and Les Mis, with their global reach, would take over $750 million. With such vast amounts of money to be made, others attempted to join the party but were found wanting. In April 1986, the West End witnessed a gamble on the most ambitious show yet.
We were the first high-tech musical in the West End. And it was amazing to me that we didn't at least receive a good critique for our stage, because it was amazing.
Once again, the designer was John Napier.
They want to have some good stuff in it. Oh, yeah. I mean, we had people floating around. People didn't know how it happened.
The whole stage lifts up and you realize that it's a spacecraft. And these platforms pull out. And I remember thinking, oh, I'm going to fall off these. But in the end, you think, this must look wonderful from out front.
It broke the boundaries of excess in almost every department.
But working with state-of-the-art special effects came with inherent risks. Time's most famous spectacle was Sir Laurence Olivier appearing as a 10-foot-high holographic head.
Stand before me on the sign of infinity, all you of the earth.
After Sir Lawrence comes on as this great sort of godly figure, the audience start to laugh, and I think, oh no. And I just turn around. In the action, I was not allowed to turn around, but I thought, I've got to look and see. Well, his eyes were here on his face, and he was speaking with his mouth down on his throat, and it was just one of those things. High technology is not perfected. It's not a perfected art form yet.
Time had broken new ground with its extraordinary sets, but without the gripping music and storylines of a Lloyd Webber or Macintosh show, it failed to live up to its contemporaries and closed after 2 years. Andrew Lloyd Webber's old writing partner Tim Rice had also found success hard to come by with the musical Blondell. But when he teamed up with one of the most successful songwriting duos of the 70s, it appeared his fortunes might be changing. As with Evita, Tim had come up with a radical idea.
Both Benny and I were intrigued because the backdrop was the Cold War. And we were, very close to the Soviet Union. The threat was very tangible from Stockholm, much more so than from London, I think.
Chess told the story of Russian and American grandmasters battling it out against a backdrop of the Cold War. An ambitious premise for a musical.
The story became convoluted, and I think a lot of people didn't quite get it, And chess can be pretty terrifying to a lot of people, just the mention of the word.
One of the problems chess has had is it is a complicated story. It's quite a grown-up story, I like to think. And really, it needs, at times, subtitles. Because when you get more than 3 or 4 people singing, it's very hard to hear the words.
Wasn't it good? So cool. Wasn't he fine? So fine.
But on opening, Chess did perform well, and with the show pulling in the audiences, Rice, Benny and Bjorn spied a chance to follow in the footsteps of Lloyd Webber and Cameron Macintosh.
After the show's success in London, the Broadway production of Chess opened in a blaze of optimism.
Is there a new word on Broadway for success? Yes, chess.
But this weekend, after only 2 months, Chess is expected to close. Killed, it's claimed, by the critics, who, with 1 or 2 notable exceptions, didn't like what they saw and heard, and said so in savage manner.
A lot of critics were very pissed off with the fact that the British invasion, Andrew Lloyd Webber, Cameron Macintosh dominated, the Broadway scene, and they certainly did not like that. And so here comes a musical that's from Europe and very vulnerable, and a musical that's easy to kill.
Derided by the critics as turgid and overblown, Chess had another problem: its timing. By the late 80s, a musical set against a backdrop of the Cold War suddenly seemed horribly out of tune.
I think Chess was clobbered by the fact that the Cold War ended. We kept worrying about what was going to be in the papers, and we'd go, oh my God, terrible news, the Berlin Wall's come down, this is awful, this will ruin our show.
And then they forced open another gate and piled through it.
The bloody Iron Curtain had to come down and ruin the whole thing for us. So it was bad timing.
Chess ultimately failed in its ambitions, just as another musical with gritty themes was finding its feet again.
Tell me it's not true.
On its launch back in '83, Blood Brothers had struggled to find an audience, but producer Bill Kenwright thought he knew how to make it a hit. Balking at a mega musical-style launch in the West End, Blood Brothers would take an altogether more slow-burn route.
We toured for a year, and during that time, the audience found it. It started off with very small audiences, but it built and built and built. And I said, Willie, can I bring it back into town? He said, no, Willie's no. Okay, fine. So I said, can we take it out on tour again? So the following year, we did another tour.
I think it toured for more than 2 years with me saying, no, I don't want it to go back to the West End. I don't want it to go back to the West End. I don't want it to go back to the West End. And in one sense, I think I was protecting a rather treasured memory.
We made it much more epic musically than it ever been before, but we kept the story small. It was a real labour of love. And at the end of the second tour, I said, can we ever go in London? Nope. Fine. Okay, fine. So we did a third tour.
Finally, on that third tour, Russell sneaked in unannounced to see the production in Manchester and was stunned by the audience reaction.
I sat in the back of the stalls at the Palace Theatre and saw 2,000 people just go mental for this show. And I had to accept that it was ridiculous of me to go on denying a London audience the chance to react the way this Manchester audience did because of trying to protect the memory. What a stupid thing to do. So I didn't even go back after the interval. I just called up and said, look, take it in.
Blood Brothers would go on to become the third longest-running musical in West End history. The show that had started life as a humble play for schools had grafted its way back into a London now dominated by the latest Lloyd Webber Macintosh blockbuster. In 1986, Andrew Lloyd Webber and Cameron Mackintosh reigned over the West End with their international mega-hits. For their latest phenomenon, Phantom of the Opera, they could now turn to a proven creative team. And for one brief moment, it even appeared that Lloyd Webber might go back into partnership with Tim Rice.
I was staying with Andrew and he played me some of the music for Phantom, which I absolutely loved. And I said, you must do this with Tim. And we'll have a reconciliation. And I arranged a dinner at Tim's home in the country. Lots of good wine. And after dinner we went into Tim's music room with an upright piano. Andrew played silence from Tim. Again. Tim speaks. The most boring music you've ever written. End of meeting.
Phantom of the Opera is there inside my mind.
Snubbed by Rice, Lloyd Webber first turned to Starlight lyricist Richard Stilgoe before finally settling on a complete unknown.
I'd never written a professional show. In fact, I'd never completed an entire musical. I'd written music and lyrics for about half a musical, which was submitted to a competition, a new competition at the time called the Vivian Ellis Prize, and Andrew was one of the judges and needed a lyricist. And I was signing on. I was on the dole, you know. So it was a lovely surprise.
And then the tune on its own.
The reason Lloyd Webber was so particular about lyrics was that Phantom was quite literally a labour of love.
wrote The Phantom of the Opera to Sarah. Wonderful thing to be able to say, isn't it? That somebody wrote such a beautiful show out of love.
Andrew falls in love with a soprano who can sing high D flats. Then the story of Phantom of the Opera about this young soprano who comes from nowhere and suddenly becomes famous. I mean, there are obvious resonances in that that haven't escaped anybody in the history of the show.
Even though Phantom was written for her, director Hal Prince wasn't going to take it on Andrew's word alone that she was the right person to star in it.
I said I'd like her to audition, and Andrew said, "My God, you're not asking the person I wrote it for to audition?" I said, "Yes," and she auditioned. There were some high E's in the score. No, you know, very difficult for any singer to hit a high E, but Sarah, that was one of Sarah's specialties. She could do that.
With Sarah confirmed, Lloyd Webber next had to cast his Phantom. On earlier musicals, he had avoided star billings, but for Phantom, he changed tack.
I was in a cafe with Andrew having lunch, and the soup spoon was on its way to my mouth. And he said, "I have asked Michael Crawford to play the Phantom, Gilly." And it never got to my mouth, the spoon. It went straight back down. Because like everybody, at that time, when you thought of Michael, you thought of Some Mothers Do Have 'Em.
That was a very shrewd piece of casting because it attracted a lot of media interest. It was perfectly logical because Michael had a lot of experience in musical theatre already, but was not widely known for it, so it was a slightly surprising idea. And because he's such a dedicated worker, you know, you get your money's worth with Michael.
Close your eyes and let music set you free. Only then can you belong to me.
He understood it's a very, very sexual role. He exudes weird sex, you know, it's slightly dark sex, but, you know, that's all the more perturbing for her, and that makes the story, actually.
Trust me, savor each sensation.
But he was thrilling to work with, and he totally understood that role.
Before we start, bear this in mind. The whole first section of this is an opera.
Yeah.
With cast complete, the task of staging such a massive spectacle as Phantom proved surprisingly straightforward.
Conventional.
It was one of the easiest shows to put together that any of us have ever worked on. I mean, compared with putting Cats together, for instance, it was a piece of cake.
Hal staged it, I think, in 3 weeks, and he only worked mornings.
I'd work from 10 to 1.
The point of no return.
Little girl in the company, one of the dancers, raised her hand and said, "I've been delegated to ask you this question." And I said, "What would it be?" And she said, "What do you do in the afternoon?"
What did you do in the afternoon?
Well, I made a joke, said I see Coronation Street, but really what I did in the afternoon was wander the West End, read books, sit in Green Park.
Phantom opened in October 1986 to overwhelmingly positive reviews. The sumptuous score, fabulous setting, and the celebrity pulling power of Michael Crawford all combining to ensure that Phantom would go on to become the most successful musical of all time.
The real cachet Phantom had is that it was pre-booked for a year. You couldn't buy a ticket. So it became an incredibly sought-after thing. So by the time tickets did become available, it had sort of become a self-sustaining entity.
On New Year's Day, 1988, Phantom opened on a Broadway now totally humbled by the new breed of musical coming from the West End.
Andrew Lloyd Webber took on Broadway, returning to it the kinds of melodies and spectacles it no longer produced for itself. The story was the same in all the theatres. Some said if it wasn't for the British, there wouldn't be any more Broadway.
And it wasn't just Broadway. Phantom and its ilk have been exported to countries far beyond the twin centres of London and New York. From unpromising beginnings at the start of the 80s, in less than a decade, the West End had conquered the world.
I think it happened to be that all the talent that was really being invented were all in Britain at that point. Simple as that, you know. And we happened to all want to do stories which had a worldwide appeal. None of us knew that up front. We were only too grateful to get through an opening night without being stoned.
Next time on The Story of the Musical, how the giants of the West End seemed to stumble and a new kind of musical entered the world of the theatre.